Hey guys, Mr. Kramer here, and for our third section of notes, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to try to do this more often throughout the year, and that is where I allow you to take these notes asynchronously, which is without everybody in the class. You kind of just do it on your own. There's a few reasons for this. Number one, and it kind of allows me to be in two places at once. I'm here in this slide, as I will be on pretty much every slide in this show. And it also allows me to be helping people with other things, in this case, a lab that we're doing with microscopes or working on the project, depending on what day you're doing this in class. Or maybe you're doing this at home, and in that case, I'm in your home, which is also two places, because I'm in my home. Here it is. Ta-da! Amazing, right? So another reason we're doing this is that this section of notes is pretty straightforward. It's a lot. This is going to go over 3 I can statements, but it's really straightforward. It's all about just getting it and having it down. So for those reasons, we're gonna try this, and I think this will hopefully speed things up and also make things a little bit easier for you. So our third topic is eukaryotic cell structure. We're talking about specifically animal cells and plant cells. We won't be talking much about any specialized cells and like protozoans like the amoeba or euglena or anything that we saw in some previous videos, but we're going to focus pretty much on animal and plant cells. Okay, our I can statements we've already covered. We've covered the principles of cell theory. We've described prokaryotes and eukaryotes, their differences, and we've also looked at why multicellular organisms have different shape and structure. And we're going to review those as well as some Unit 1 topics here in a little bit. The I can statements we're going to go over in this section of notes. You can see here we're going to go over the major parts of the light microscope. Now we're not doing that necessarily in this topic, but while some of you are watching these notes, others will be using the microscopes in our microscope lab activity. We're also going to be looking at all the major cell structures, including organelles of animal cells, and then the 3 additional cell structures that we can find in plant cells. And because of that, we'll have a bunch of new vocabulary. I know it's covered up by the camera, but we'll have a bunch of new vocabulary that we want to make sure we can pronounce appropriately. Okay, so what I want to do in this first part of this presentation is I would just like to take some time to do a self quiz. Now I'm at home. I unfortunately don't have my unit booklet. It's sitting on my desk at school. But I hope you have yours. I didn't grab mine after the field trip, so I hope you have yours. And if you flip to the second page, we have our learning behaviors, the behaviors of successful students. And you'll see on that second page that one of our learning behaviors, and if I remember correctly, it's learning behavior number 2, is to do self-checks and to always kind of be checking where you're at. So this is a warm-up quiz that's a kind of a self-check quiz as well. It's not for a grade, but please try it. So just somewhere, like a random piece of paper or somewhere in your booklet. If you're using your booklet, that left column is a really good area there. I have, I think, 6 multiple choice questions here. Just try them all. So our first one is, which of these is not a part of the cell theory? A, cells are the basic unit, structure, function, organization for living things. B, new cells are produced from old cells. C, cells are the smallest of all particles and cannot be divided. Or D, all living things are composed of cells. Write down your answer, and we'll move on to number 2. If you need more time, feel free to pause. For question 2, which characteristic is true of eukaryotes? Is it A, that they are larger in size, that being compared to prokaryotes? B, an example of them is bacteria. C, they do not have a nucleus. Or D, they do not contain membrane-bound organelles like a mitochondria or an endoplasmic reticulum. Again, pause if you need more time, but we're going to move on to number 3. For number 3, your body contains numerous types of cells, including skin, muscle, and blood. Which of the following reasons is why you have so many types of cells? Is it A, cells are located in different parts of the body? B, cells produce different proteins? C, cells have different shapes and therefore different functions? Or D, every cell in your body is exactly the same, no matter which type it is? Pause if you need more time. I'm going to say that on every slide, so let's just keep going. Number 4, which of the following macromolecules is considered to be fatty and cannot dissolve in water, therefore is a good material for building permeable, flexible barriers? Is it A, carbohydrates, B, proteins, C, lipids, or D, nucleic acids? Write down your answer or pause if you need more time. For question number 5, what is the function of proteins within a cell? A, they provide structure and support to the cell. B, they control the cell's processes. C, they store genetic information. Or D, they have many different functions and it is impossible to list them all on this slide. Pause if you need more time. We're moving on to number 6. Who was the scientist that was credited with the discovery of the cell? Is it A, Robert Hooke, B, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, C, Matthias Schwann, or D, Isaac Newton? That is our final warm-up question, our kind of self-check quiz. And what's going to happen next is I'm going to put those onto the, I'll put the answers up in a second and we'll kind of go over them very quickly. If you need more time for this one, please pause. All right, so you can see the answers for our warm-up self-check quiz. And for that first one, that was the cell theory question, which was cannot be divided. They're the smallest particles, cannot be divided, something like that. That's actually true of atoms and the atomic theory, but not the cell theory. Number 2 was the question about what's true of prokaryotes, and that is that they are larger in size, which was letter A. Number 3 was about cell differentiation. Why do cells look different? That's because they have different shapes due to their different functions. That's true for eukaryotic cells, including the cells in your body. Number 4 was a question about macromolecules. The answer was C, lipids. Which ones are fatty and are nice permeable membranes? We'll learn more about the cell membrane, which will happen in this topic, but also again in Unit 3. Number 5 was about proteins and their functions, and that's D, that they have so many functions. So our bodies can make around 20,000 different proteins that all do different things. And number 6 was Robert Hooke. That was just a fun question. Not a question that's going to answer an I can't statement, but a good one nonetheless. Here's kind of what I would say, how you did, kind of a grading scale. So if you got a 6, you're awesome. If you got a 5, you're still awesome. If you got a 3 or 4, that's still good. I just say, probably double check some notes. A 1 or a 2 were a little bit more in trouble, considering this is information from every topic that we've covered so far this year. So pay a little bit more attention, do more practice, study a little bit more. And if you get a 0, if we got a 0, we're in trouble. Let's move on to cell organelles and structure function. Now, as we go through all the cell parts, you're probably thinking to yourself, what's the point of all this? And that's a fair question. And you may ask yourself that question if you don't think about it at the cellular level. But I'm asking you to go down to the cellular level and look at an individual cell, no matter the cell type of your body, which, by the way, again, your body has about 200 different types of cells. And I want you to think, what is the point of this thing? Hopefully you're not thinking, what's the point of this class? That's terrible. But what is the point of the thing? What is the point of a cell? And then you might think to yourself, well, does it make something? Is it moving something? Is it changing something? What is it that this cell is doing? And those are all great questions, even if you're thinking at the cellular level. But what I want you to do is, make an analogy of it. And I have a good analogy to cells, what I think is a good analogy. And in our project, you're going to be allowed to make your own analogy. But cells absolutely make, change, move things. They're constantly doing something. We have to think of them as a small factory, because that's really what they are. So I like to use an analogy to help explain what the point of cells is. And it's a little bit of a weird analogy, but just try to follow. Obviously, cells do make, they change, they move things. And so I started to think about what else makes similar things, but they do it in different ways, because that's kind of what cells do. They all make stuff. They make proteins, they make lipids, they change carbohydrates. They're doing that, but each cell does it in its own individual way, even though what it's making is all different, but kind of the same. So again, just go with me on this analogy. Here are three very different types of cars. Obviously, we have a Volkswagen Beetle at the top, an old one. We've got a Lamborghini there as well. And then down at the bottom, a smart car. And three very different cars, but also they have similar things too. They're not so different that you can't understand that that's a car. They all have four wheels, they all have bumpers, they all have headlights, they all have steering wheels. We hope they all have brakes. They all have doors, windows, windshields, wipers. They all have some similarities, but they are created in slightly different ways. And the car isn't the cell, but the factory is. Let me show you what I mean. If you take a look at the three different car factories, you'll see this. Here's the factory for the Volkswagen. It has the assembly line, piece by piece, at each station, parts are being added, and it's specific to the Volkswagen, but it looks like all car factories. I can prove it to you. Here's the Lamborghini factory. Again, there's an assembly line. Okay, it's a little bit nicer, a little bit cleaner, better tools. I get that. But the way to make the car is still kind of the same, because even though it's making a different car, it's still a car. Here's a smart car. Smart cars have even, I don't know if it's higher tech or just a better quality picture, but we've got, again, that assembly line, piece by piece is being added. Here in the front or the foreground of the picture, we have a completed car. Cells are making and moving and transporting things. They're changing things. It's just that each cell is doing it slightly different. But because they're all making the same kinds of materials, they're all making these macromolecules, we can kind of talk about them all in the same way. We can generalize all cell types, animal cell types, eukaryotic cell types, just a little bit. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through all of the cell structures that you need to know for Biology 9 and to prepare you for the IB, if you choose to go on to Biology IB. And we're going to do so in a way that is going to generalize a little bit. Like we have this factory. This factory can make some different products, but all the products are also kind of the same. And understand that not every cell in your body is going to have the same number of cell structures or cell parts. Some cells have more mitochondria, some cells have more lysosomes. It just kind of depends on what that function of the cell is. But for the most part, all the cells in your body are going to have some kind of arrangement of these cell structures. We'll also do plant cells as well at the very end to cover ICANN statement number 6. Okay, what I'd like you to do for this and what I think will help is if you flip to the back of your booklet, the very last page, you'll see a chart that looks similar to this. It's not the exact same. This is a kind of an older version. But you'll see something that looks like this. So it'll have all of the organelles listed on the left. You'll see the space for the analogy, a space for the function, space for the fact. So the first thing you'll see on each slide is the function. That's the most important thing, the thing we absolutely need to get written down. The analogy, we're going to use a comparison to our car factory analogy. And the fact is just a fact about that organelle that I took from the book. probably the least important thing to write down. On your table, you also see a column with some different playing cards. You'll see on the slides as well some different playing cards. That's for if we were doing this in class, but since we're using the video, no need to worry about that. I'm going to move through these pretty fast, so feel free to pause at any time if you need. Our first organelle is the nucleus. The nucleus controls cell functions, and very, very important thing, it protects genetic information, DNA. It's very important that our DNA is not damaged. Obviously, we're talking about eukaryotic cell structure, so our cells have a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not. For our car factory analogy, this is like the boss of the cell, or the CEO. And I really like this analogy because not only does the boss kind of control what's happening, but they also usually protect any important blueprints for our cars that are being made. Those blueprints are like our DNA. So the plans to make proteins are inside the DNA. And so the boss's job is to protect those in his office. Just a fun fact about the nucleus, DNA never leaves the nucleus except for when the cell's dividing. We'll learn about that in Unit 6. But the nucleus actually will dissolve away for a short time and then reform at the end of cell division. Our next cell structure, this is not necessarily an organelle, is the ribosome. The ribosomes produce proteins or build proteins. This is where protein synthesis occurs. These are like the little factory machines inside of our car factory. These are the I don't know, like maybe it's people, I guess. The Volkswagen picture looked like it was people, but you know those like robotic arms. Every time I think about these robotic arms that are adding parts, I think about Iron Man, Tony Stark, RIP. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just ignore it. For those of you that like the MCU, that's awesome. A fact is that these they don't have a membrane like the nucleus has an actual membrane called the nuclear envelope. Mitochondria have a membrane made of phospholipids. These are just small, they're little pieces of RNA and protein that are kind of attached together. And there's many of them. There's not just a couple. They're kind of all over the cell, either in the cytosol or cytoplasm, or attached to rough ER, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean next slide. I didn't realize there's a next slide. So our rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER, this is a system of membrane that helps transport the molecules. This is kind of like our conveyor belt. It's the thing, or our assembly line conveyor belt. It's the thing that kind of is moving our molecules down the line or moving our cars down the line. So if you think about this, our cars that are being made by the car factory, that is our proteins or our lipids that are being created. And so this is the thing that kind of moves those molecules down the line the same way a car does. Rough ER are rough because under a microscope, they kind of look grainy. It looks like almost like they're covered in sand. And so it's not sand that they're covered with, it's actually ribosomes. And because of that, these will make special types of phospholipids, and they'll also make proteins, which is what ribosomes are building. Smooth ER, or smooth endoplasmic reticulum, is next. Because the function and the analogy are the same as the rough ER, I'm not going to go over them a lot, but I do want to talk about the fact. The fact is really interesting here because smooth ER does not have ribosomes. That's why it's considered smooth. It doesn't have that grainy texture under a microscope. Because it doesn't have the ribosomes, it builds other materials. So the smooth ER can build other lipids such as cholesterol, which is an important lipid. It's kind of a fatty lipid that helps protect our blood vessels, and steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone. And you may be thinking that testosterone is produced by men in the testes, and estrogen is produced by women. And that's true to a sense, but both men and women need both estrogen and testosterone. They just serve different roles for development. But all people produce estrogen and testosterone thanks to our smooth ER. And we are moving on to the next organelle. which is the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus is another membrane-bound organelle that's really important. As molecules move down the assembly line of the ER, they come to the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus will sort, modify, and transport any proteins and lipids so they can go where they need to go. In our car factory analogy, this is kind of like the mailroom. So it gets all the car parts and then takes those car parts, boxes them up, and sends them to the different parts of the factory so that those parts can be added to the car and do what they need to do. It's also a little bit of quality control. So the Golgi apparatus will do kind of last and final checks of those proteins and lipids just to make sure that everything is okay. Now, one thing that's very important in the fact for this one is that it packs and ships these materials in vesicles. Vesicles is actually a vocab word. These are little tiny phospholipid bubbles, I suppose is the best way to say it. But they're little packages where these materials go into so that they can be moved to either another part of the cell that they were created or possibly even out of the cell to another cell if needed. Another important organelle is a lysosome. Lysosomes are very important because their function is to break down macromolecules, so they help with digestion. They actually have those enzymes that can break apart those big carbohydrates, those disaccharides, and convert them into monosaccharides that the cell can actually use. But lysosomes can also help break down any worn out organelles that aren't properly doing their jobs, and can even release enzymes if the cell is dying. And we'll actually talk about that process a little bit later on in the year. The analogy for this is kind of like the cleanup crew or janitors. And a fact about this is that they are actually special types of vesicles created by the Golgi apparatus. If you read in the book, you might also read about peroxisomes. Peroxisomes are a kind of like cousin of lysosomes. Peroxisomes are very important too because they do the same thing. They're just a small vesicle that has enzymes, but they have enzymes that help break down harmful chemicals like H2O2, which is hydrogen peroxide, which builds up in our cells through just basic metabolic processes. Those are toxic, as we talked about when we did the elephant toothpaste, RIP Jeffrey. And so yeah, peroxisomes help break down that hydrogen peroxide. Very similar to lysosomes, just depends on what material is being broken down. Our next organelle is the mitochondria, and this is another membrane-bound organelle. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You might have heard that before. I feel like that's something a lot of people hear. It creates ATP from organic molecules gained from photosynthesis or consumed from food. So for animal cells, obviously, animals eat. We are consumers. Plant cells have mitochondria too, and that's always like a big something that a lot of students get confused very easily. So plant cells also have mitochondria. They need ATP as well, and this is the only organelle that can make it. Plant cells just use carbohydrates that they made from photosynthesis, not from food that they ate. So yeah, the analogy for this, these are like the power generators. And a fact for this is that mitochondria actually have their own DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is it's about somewhere in the range of 300,000 base pairs or 300,000 nucleotide pairs, as opposed to the 3 billion that we have in the nucleus. So it's not nothing, but because of that, scientists believe that mitochondria were probably at one time a prokaryote that kind of just lived closely to the very first eukaryotic cells that existed on the earth and then kind of moved in, and the eukaryote was like, oh, hey, you're cool, you're making ATP, you can stay. And then they kind of just became an organelle. At least that's the theory. It does have some merit considering mitochondria have their own DNA. Kind of a cool thing. Oh, one other side fact. If you trace that mitochondrial DNA, if you trace it back to previous generations, all of the mitochondria came from the first mitochondria that you got. So all of our mitochondria, they get copied and they go to all of our cells. So they can all be traced back to the very first mitochondria you had. Mitochondrion, sorry, that's singular. And that came from your mom. And they found that out by tracing the DNA. So all of your mitochondria came from your mom because all of the mitochondria DNA came from your first mitochondrion, which came from your mom. I've been talking about this for 2 minutes. We're going to go on to the next one now. Our next organelle is the plasma membrane or cell membrane. I'm actually going to change this because I think we typically try to use cell membrane more often. Plasma membrane is a good way to think about it, and we'll talk a little bit about why it's a plasma membrane in Unit 3, but for now we can just kind of go with cell membrane. The cell membrane has a very important job, and like I mentioned earlier, it gets its own unit. It's so important, but it allows materials to enter and leave the cell. It also separates internal reactions, things that are going on in the cells, metabolic reactions, from external environment. It keeps the things out that need to stay out and the things in that need to stay in. And this is really good. That's why things like viruses are very tricky, because they have to trick the cell membrane into letting them in the cell so they can affect that cell. The analogy for this is kind of like the security gate or a fence, if you think about it, at our factory. So even big factories, if you've ever seen a car factory, they usually have security gates similar to what we have at school here, just much bigger, where they check and say, hey, this is the truck with all of the tires that the factory needs. Okay, come on in. We've got our tires now. The cell membrane does something very similar. Now, the cell membrane is made of phospholipids, and we'll learn about its structure more in Unit 3, but it's a phospholipid bilayer, which means it's 2 layers of phospholipids. And because they're fatty molecules like we had in the warm-up quiz, they're very fluid. They can move around kind of like this. It looks like I'm dancing in the camera, so I will stop. Let's go on to the next one. Our next cell structure, this is not an organelle, is the cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton is the cell structure that gives the cell structure, movement, shape. It makes the cell the shape it is. It is like the steel beams in the factory, the things in the walls that you can't see that give that building shape, just like any building. It's like if you think about our classroom, we've got that huge pillar that's just in the way. I'm sure that would have been taken out if it wasn't necessary. It's a very important part to the structure of the building. That's kind of like the cytoskeleton. There are 4 different cytoskeleton fibers that we're going to talk about in this class, and we kind of talk about them a couple other times later on in the year. And so we're going to go over those 4 now. So our first type of cytoskeleton we're going to talk about are microtubules. Microtubules are a very important type because inside the cell you have the cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm is really 3 parts. You have all the organelles except for the nucleus. We're not including the nucleus, that's kind of its own thing. You have the cytoskeleton, and you have something called cytosol. Cytosol is the liquid part of the cell, and it's mostly water with some other dissolved things in it. If it wasn't for the cytoskeleton, the cell would kind of be just this liquidy mush. And so the cytoskeleton really helps the organelles stay in place. It keeps them in place. And the microtubules do that. Those are these blue things here. They kind of remind me of like, it's not really like a spaghetti noodle because they're hollow. They're like a pasticcio noodle, which, by the way, sorry, Greek kids, pasticcio is good, but a little bit overrated. Let's be real here. It's great. It's fine. It's nothing to get crazy about. Like every Greek person I've ever met. You don't like pasticcio? Well, the noodles remind me of the cytoskeleton, so there's that. And if I say that, I look like a weirdo, so I kind of just internalize that. Anyways, what do we learn on this slide? Microtubules are hollow tubes of protein. Pasticcio is good, but not the greatest dish on the earth. Fair enough. Let's go on to the next one. Microfilaments are really important. They aid in cell movement if the cell does move, and we do have some cells that move, for instance, sperm cells. Our muscle cells actually have a lot of microfilaments. These you can see here, kind of these green things and these purple things down here at the bottom. And the reason why these are so important is because these are the parts of the cytoskeleton that are triggered by our nerves for muscle cells to contract and relax. And so these are really important every time you move. Microfilaments are firing. I know that in the IB classes, they go into depth about how that works. But for us right now, all we need to know is there are thin strands of protein that make up the cytoskeleton. The last part of the cytoskeleton we're going to go over, there's actually two of them, and that's cilia and flagella. Those are plural words. It is cilium for one and flagellum for one. And these are structures made of proteins that extend outside of the cell membrane. Typically, they're used for cell movement, although there are some eukaryotic cells that have specialized cilia that, like in our airways, for instance, that do filtering. They help try to, catch any particulate matter, some, those large particulates that go in our airway so they don't get down into our lungs. Cilia are usually really numerous. We can see that right here. This is a eukaryotic cell. It's a single-celled protozoan. It has cilia. You can see all these little hairs. Those cilia will kind of like beat or flap to help that thing move. On the right side, this is actually a prokaryote. It's a bacteria, but it has 4 flagella. The best example of a eukaryotic cell that has a flagellum is a sperm cell. That's the tail. That tail obviously helps the cell move. I promise you we're getting close to being done. If you look at your table, you see we have 3 left. We've moved past the cytoskeleton now, and we're on to our final 3, which are only in plant cells. You should see that on the table. There's a little kind of side box that says that. And the first thing that plant cells have that animal cells do not is a cell wall. The cell wall provides shape and structure to the plant cell. So it does not have, plants do not have a cell wall instead of a cell membrane. You have the cell membrane, and then right outside of that is the cell wall. And the cell wall is kind of like the building walls. They're hard. Now, our car factory animal cells have building walls too, but this is the best I could come up with for the analogy. These are the hard things that give it our factory that boxy look. The cell wall is made of a polysaccharide called cellulose, and I'm sure you guys have all experienced the cell wall before, because every time you bite into a vegetable, there's usually a crunch. Onions have a crunch. Lettuce even has a crunch, unless it's like gross and wilted lettuce. Celery has a crunch. Maybe you've broken, you've broken a leaf before, and you've noticed that it kind of snaps. That's the cell walls that provide that crunch. Now the good thing about the cell wall, it does have some holes. Those holes allow things to get to the cell membrane, so then the cell membrane can do its job of either allowing it into the cell or not allowing it into the cell. Our second to last organelle, again, is only in plant cells. This is the central vacuole. The central vacuole is very important. It stores stuff, mostly water. If you look at, there's a really great picture in the textbook. I don't remember what page it's on, but it shows a full cell vacuole. It takes up a ton of space in the cell. But the central vacuole can also store enzymes, waste, other materials. Animal cells might have vacuoles, but there will not be like one big one, like in the case of the central vacuole for plant cells. Obviously, plants need a lot of water, so it makes sense. This is kind of like the warehouse of our factory. And as I said, the central vacuole can take up as much as 90% of the plant cell's volume. So it can push all of the other organelles into the cell wall and the cell membrane when it's full. It's not good for a central vacuole to be completely full. We'll talk about why that is in Unit 3. And we've made it to the last one. The last one is a chloroplast. Chloroplasts use light energy to make carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are then converted into ATP by the plant's mitochondria. It does this through photosynthesis with carbon dioxide and water. Now, it's not really fair because solar panels make energy. It's as if these are the solar panels that are charging the batteries for the power generators, I suppose. It was another one that was tough to come up with a perfect analogy, but they do use sunlight in the case of most producers. And just like mitochondria, these also have their own DNA. And just like mitochondria, scientists think that at one time these were prokaryotes. They also contain the green pigment chlorophyll. Okay, and we have finished. This is our summary. If you have any questions for the good of the cause, you might hear a human being made of different types of cells in the background. That's okay. There he is. If there are any questions for the good of the cause, please make sure to ask. Here's our summary. For our summary, we really focus on the organelles that are involved in protein production. So I just want you to see if you can go through all the functions and list those. If you get it right, there are 4 of them. 4 of them. Yes. Okay. No complaining at this guy. And I will see you guys in the next video.